Klaus Jensen. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you. He's a communication researcher and has been focusing on digital and mobile media over the last years. He has been recently working on the Internet of China, Europe, and the United States, dealing with the global institutional struggle over individual data rights. And yeah, thanks a lot for joining us, Klaus, and looking very much forward to your presentation.
My presentation today suggests taking a communication perspective on AI and human rights. I divided the presentation into three segments. One, application infrastructures these days, and I'll address something that, at least in my field, we refer to as many-to-one communication. The fact that although we may think of communication as the transfer of information between senders and receivers, or from media and onto users, we are in fact, all of us, constantly communicating into the system. And I'll address that in terms of changing communication infrastructures. Then in the second part, I'll illustrate some of the points from a recent project that we did here in Copenhagen with colleagues around the world. And I'll emphasize the point that for many purposes, we need to be talking about the internet, and we need to put internet in the plural. And lastly, I'll address some of the wider normative questions that come up in connection with the perspective on human rights. Frequently, freedoms of information and expression is what we associate with the communication perspective, but we also need to think about communications as the increasingly programmed and institutionalized forms of communication that condition basically what we can do as individuals and as communities and societies. So let's see. So communication 101, it's common to make a distinction between at least three different kinds of historical prototypes of communication. One we could consider the evolutionary baseline. No social life, no social coordination or cooperation would be possible without communication. The second type, what we used to refer to back in the 20th century as mass communication, that is one-to-many communication, came to us with printing and broadcasting, and facilitated the coming of modern arts, modern sciences, and modern forms of governance. Now, most recently with digitalization, we have been facilitating new forms of networked or many-to-many communication. But there's a fourth form of communication that we need to consider in order to unfold the communication perspective on AI and human rights. That is this form of many-to-one communication that I briefly referred to at the outset, the recording, processing of forms of communication via AI augmented platforms. We see the system. We leave behind bit trails, and those bit trails enter, as some of the previous presentations have mentioned, into opaque chains of reference. The data is sold and resold and used for a good number of both legitimate and illegitimate purposes. All this shapes not just how people access information, but how we actually interact socially, how we participate politically, and how we are in a position to ensure our personal privacy. This could be summarized in this very basic model. So we tend to think of communication as this transfer of information from a sender to a receiver, from a system to a user. So at the top here, we have communication one, but all along the way, constantly, all the time, anywhere, are doing what communication theory refers to as meta-communication, inputting evidence of what they are doing at the other end of the system. Now, all familiar with the way in which this then shapes subsequent communications, here communication to communication N, the recommendations that we constantly receive, the worries that we have about what kinds of information and misinformation we do and do not receive. So with this changed set of conditions for human communication, both locally and globally, we initiate a project that was called the People's Internet. We treated the internet as basically the global communication infrastructure of the 21st century in a good number of ways. Affect both the life prospects of individuals, the prosperity and governance of nations, and the relative positions and interrelations of both regions. How will regions be relating to each other, both in market terms, in terms of trade, and how will regions be open to various forms of communicative interaction? So in that sense, the internet circumscribes, it conditions, it frames what we can do as individuals and as communities, but it also inscribes what we do. It offers input to the social imagination, who we would like to be as individuals, as nations, and as world regions. And for the purpose of that study, we decided to examine 3 contemporary centers of the global economy and geopolitics. So China, Europe, and the United States. And I should say I'm here treating Europe as a block. We had 5 different European countries. There's all kinds of interesting differences there that I'll leave out for present purposes. What we found was, and I won't go into the details of the methodology, but basically we combined population surveys in 7 countries with ethnographies and with big data analyses of the kinds of flows of information that occur within digital communication systems, the sort of tracking that is constantly going on through so-called third-party services. We basically found a great number of similarities in terms of one-to-one communication. We also found that, contrary to what you often find reported, certainly in the general press and in public debate, mass communication is well and alive. People have not stopped attending to the classic mass. Its historical standard emerged and has lived on. And in terms of many-to-many communication, both our study and other studies are increasingly emphasizing the fact that maybe we should think of this as few-to-few communication, that there are certain limits, both cognitively and socially, to how many people we're able to relate to. And lastly, we looked at many-to-one communication. These presentations have also referred to the surveillance aspect, the fact that we cannot not communicate into the system. In and of our use of digital systems, a great deal of data and metadata is registered and processed in ways that remain entirely opaque. And maybe it's important to emphasize the fact that surveillance has traditionally been associated with state or governmental surveillance. It's important, I think, to recognize also that commercial surveillance is very much a part of the picture. What we also find is that there are very localized and contextualized ways in which all this evidence, all this data is registered, and the kinds of third-party services that operate in different parts of the world may be dependent on what we tend to refer to as a lump form as big tech. But there's all kinds of very localized and very specialized kinds of services that are constantly surveilling people. Stepping back from these more detailed of how people actually communicate on the internet, we found, and other colleagues have been making similar points about the existence of not one, but at present, perhaps 3+1 internets. The original vision, of course, was what O'Hara and Wendy Hall referred to as the Silicon Valley Open Internet. This idea of a new generalized medium that would be enabling both the expression and the empowerment of the general user. Many of you are old enough to recall the heady days of the 1990s when this was very much talked about and hoped for. We look at the realities of the 20s. It's rather three main models of the internet that we see in terms of how the services operate and in terms of how they are governed. What started out as the Silicon Valley Open Internet has been replaced, or at least sidelined, by what again O'Hara and Hall refer to as the DC commercial internet, and I'll return to some of the implications of that. Secondly, we have a contrary, or at least different movement ongoing within the European Union in terms of what has been referred to here as Brussels bourgeois internet. The idea that we would need, based on frictions of social services and the welfare state, we would need a different kind of regulation to be applied also to the internet. And thirdly, the Beijing paternal internet. Of course, the word paternal may be too kind in the present context. Other scholars would refer to it as authoritarian or autocratic. In any event, it is certainly the case that if we look at the global picture of the internet, with the so-called Great Firewall around China, China is, in that sense, separated from other kinds of communications going on in other parts of the world. Now, O'Hara and Hall add what they call the +1 internet. They refer to it as the Moscow spoiler. There's the first three, the DC commercial internet, the Brussels bourgeois internet, and the Beijing paternal internet, can be seen as models of how we might want to organize the internet, depending on our perception of the relationship between individual and state. The Moscow spoiler is essentially a non-model. There is, at least according to that argument, no specific aim of developing a fourth model, but simply to take advantage of the internet for whatever purposes, commercial, hacking, distribution of misinformation, and so forth. So coming on to the normative normative implications. It's that if we look at the historical development of what could be referred to, just as we would refer to means of production, we need to refer more broadly to means of communication in society. We used to operate in the 20th century with an understanding of mass media systems that would somehow or to some extent support public debate and other forms of social interaction. Our argument would be that we've moved into a different era through digitalization, so that we cannot anymore speak of media systems, but need to think of communication systems, particular kind of system that integrates all the previous forms of communication that have been associated or broadcasting, or even with embodied forms of communication in the case of interpersonal communication. That also means that we try to assess the implications of communication systems for communication rights and other rights. We need to move beyond the sorts of freedoms of information and expression that have been with us. At least the understanding of these is central, at least since the 18th century. We need to think about the ways in which communication systems also shape information access and either facilitate or block interaction with large political participation, personal privacy, and so forth. So from what could be considered at least a potentially globalized internet, we have moved through what a number of authors have referred to as a splinternet, and specifically it's a regionalized splinternet with separate regulatory regimes represented here by the US, the EU, and the China versions. Not that these regulatory regimes are restricted to those geographical regions, but they may be understood as ways in which the internet might develop in the years ahead, in decades ahead. And they are currently in standoff in various international or international collaborative organizations that we need to address, I believe, in normative terms. So as a last reflection, we can return to the idea that we have the right to communicate. It was formalized, of course, in connection with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Many of the classic issues remain, although infrastructures of communication have been changing. And if we think of human rights as freedoms, two different classic issues or distinctions tend to come up. At least in Western debates, certainly here in the European context, and I believe also in the North American context, it's common when we speak about freedom of information and communication relating to make the distinction between us and them, China and us, referring to different varieties of democracy and autocracy in regions of the world. So that's one dividing line between the Beijing paternal internet and other varieties of the internet. But the understanding of human rights as freedoms also recalls the classic distinction both before and after Isaiah Berlin between negative freedom and positive freedom. Freedom, of course, associated with the liberal as negative freedom from something, the freedom, especially from interference of authorities, states, into the business of individuals, but also into the business of business, into the activities of organizations and companies that have an interest in exactly this kind of being left alone. And in that sense, we could see the current DC commercial internet variant as an instantiation of negative freedom. Compared to this, we could see positive freedom as related to and instantiated by the Brussels bourgeois internet. The freedom would be emphasizing that we do not have freedom as such. Freedom is something we accomplish together as a community, something that we cultivate over time through institutions that secure the conditions of good lives by individuals and groups. I was very interested to hear Darius's account of the capabilities tradition, where I think you could see the capabilities tradition as one of the most interesting and sophisticated contributions to defining a positive freedom to communicate and to do many other kinds of things. The positive freedom to do and to be. I think I'll leave you with that. I've been drawing on recent book publications in this talk, and I'll look forward to comments. I think we should have time for a few questions and more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Klaus. Thank you for this very elaborate presentation.